I'm also a serial entrepreneur, and I work with a lot of teams on a lot of different skill sets around negotiation. Recently, I worked with a particular union that was trying to renegotiate their contract for their employees. So firsthand, I have some experience around this particular issue, how a lot of people are dissatisfied with work and they feel that they're being paid unfairly compared to what's out there. So the main issue or goal for us was to figure out, how do we negotiate? How do we really shift the structural, dynamics that could really, provide a sustainable, package and contract with the employees and the employers. So that's my focus, and I'd like to research. I'm a practitioner, a lot there to share about myself. But overall, I'm a dad. I live in Miami Beach, and I love to learn from the best of the best. And we're lucky here today to have an incredible panel. So looking forward to learning and getting some great takeaways. So I wanted to start out immediately. We have a lot and a very full agenda. So we're going to start out with, and again, if you have any questions or burning remarks, please feel free to have a chat conversation, and we'll definitely will acknowledge it. But I want to immediately start out with presenting our first presenter and speaker, who's going to give us some insights on what's really happening. So right now, if Dr. And I'm going to say this right, Chantal Line, Dr. Chantal Line, if you don't mind opening your video, and we're going to have a great talk here. She's going to give us a great keynote remarks on what's really happening, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself, because I know I read her bio and it's very impressive, very extensive, so we could spend like 2 hours just talking about her background. So I'm going to set the stage to you. I'm going to turn off my camera. Without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much, Oscar, and it's a pleasure to be here with such accomplished people and caring people. And care will be one of the major topics of my talk today, as I set the stage for women on equal opportunities at work. So let me first thank this opportunity to thank the organizers and to of this webinar to discuss this very, very important issue of pay equity in the context of women in equal opportunities at work and in entrepreneurship. Let me deep dive into three main messages in the next few minutes that have been given. Oh, I was told to introduce myself. So my name is impronounceable for non-French speaking people. I'm Canadian from Quebec. My name is Chantal Line Carpentier, and I'm the chief of the UN Conference on Trade and Development Office in New York City. This is a UN outfit that focuses on investment, development, trade, entrepreneurship, and in technologies, mostly focused on helping developing countries. So what I would like to do is to deep dive into three main messages, as I said. Unpaid and underpaid work is one of the main culprits for gender inequality, which is worse now than it was 10 years ago. The good news, though, because that could be very depressing, is that the pandemic has made this point clear and loud, even to those that didn't want to hear it before the pandemic. And what we at the UN, and specifically at UNCTAD, we are doing. So let's start with the job market. So women face occupational segregation with lack of access to decent work and wage gaps that heavily impede our progress toward the 2030 agenda on achieving SDG 5, SDG 10, and SDG 1, as well as SDG 3. I hope the audience is familiar with the SDGs. SDG 5 is gender equality and economic empowerment of women. SDG 10 is elimination of poverty and of inequality, and 1 is poverty, and 3 is education. So women are overrepresented in informal and vulnerable employment, and this is why they were most affected by this pandemic. So they're in the service industry, so restaurant and hotels and all of these things that actually got shut down during the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, the share of women in informal employment in developing countries was about a little less than 5%, higher than that of men. And when including agricultural workers, it was almost 8% higher than men. So that means they work in the informal sector, they don't have any benefit, they have no protection. They also tend to be concentrated, as I mentioned, into sectors that offer lower pay, low employment security and benefit. And gender inequality are deep-rooted in every society. So with gender difference inscribed into laws in both developing and developed nations in our region of the world. So for instances, there are over 2.7 billion women globally that are legally restricted from having the same jobs as men. 100 out of 189 economies assessed in 2018 still have laws on the book preventing women from working in specific jobs. And in 18 countries, husbands can still legally prevent their wife from working. Women remain less likely to participate in the labor market than men, with 62% of women aged 25 to 54, the core age, in the labor market. So 62% of women compared to 94% of men worldwide. Legal and cultural constraints limit women's ability to achieve the highest leadership position, such that women make up only 5% of Fortune 500 companies' leadership, 26% representation in the national parliaments, 36% of local government, which is, by the way, the highest number, and 28% of managerial position worldwide, 28%, and yet we represent 50%, more than 50% of the population. And 81 countries have never had a woman head of state. Women entrepreneurs, which oftentimes are by necessity as opposed to by their own will, first because they're trying to solve a problem, second because they don't have a job, face additional constraints such as accessing financing, combined with shrinking trade finance access for micro, small, medium enterprises, where again, women tend to be concentrated, which has got worse during the pandemic. Women managed firm during the pandemic were 27% more likely to file for insolvency or bankruptcy than men during the pandemic. Now, let's move to one of the major culprits, as I mentioned, which is unpaid work, which leads to these things. So women tend to go to this sector. Why? Because they want to have more flexibility on their hours, because they have a greater share of their work that is unpaid, that is done at home or with the elders or within their communities. So women bear disproportionate responsibility for this unpaid care and domestic work, providing 2.5% times more unpaid care and domestic work than men. The amount of time women devote to unpaid care work is negatively correlated with their labor force participation, unsurprisingly. Women spend 76% of unpaid work time, but 43% of paid work time. And if we combine paid and unpaid work, women contribute to 50% of the total work hours, exceeding men hours. And this, despite the number we just saw, which is women's lower labor force participation rate. Unpaid care work, taking care of children, elderlies, is essential to the functioning of the economy, as exemplified during the pandemic, where a lot of women have quit their job. And in the US, we call it the Great Resignation. In Canada, where I come from, actually, there's less unemployment than there were before the COVID-19. And actually, one positive thing is migrant employment rate went up. However, the one thing that didn't go up is women my age in the labor force. There is where the resignation happened in Canada. And it would be interesting to hear from others on this webinar what happened in their countries, because I think it's important to go into this. And despite this invaluable contribution of unpaid care in our society, it continued to be largely treated by mainstream economics as an externality being unaccounted for in our policies and our national account or GDP. And we're talking big numbers. We saw that women provide more total work than men if we add unpaid and paid work. And at a full 41% of total work time globally is unpaid. The associated costs in the form of foregone wages and opportunities for women and girls amplify the gender inequality. Two concepts of the purple economy, which I want to go into right now. Because of increased unpaid care load during the pandemic, because this is, I just want to give you a number because this is so important. Gender gap was set back globally by 37 years. That is, before the pandemic, it would have taken 99 years, the World Economic Forum had estimated, to reach equality. Now we are at 136 years. Collectively, women have lost US $800 billion in earnings in 2020 due to the pandemic. Women already represent something less than 10% of the total wealth on the planet, and yet they're the one that were the big loser in terms of wealth in 2020. And 13 million fewer women are at work now than they were in 2019. Now, what's the response to this? The good news is, there's two good news. In the pandemic, there's always silver lining. One of them is that we've recognized the value of small, medium enterprises and entrepreneurship. And second, we've recognized the role of women in unpaid care. And this is why the UN is developing tools to help countries take into account unpaid work. And we define it as any work for which someone could be contracted out, including unpaid childcare, adult care, nutrition, transport, household management services, laundry and clothing services, informal volunteering, shopping, and informal services. And UNCTAD, with UN Women and ILO and ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America, are leading the development of a brief on the purple economy for the UN network of economists that will help our country representatives. So the UN is present in 133 developing countries in the world, to advise decision makers at the national and subnational level to take the care and unpaid care economy into account in their decision making and in their policies. The care economy is referred as the purple economy because of the color adopted by the many feminist movement and feminist economists. And they're the one that present this vision of economics that recognize the importance of care work and the interlinkages to empowerment and autonomy of women to the functioning of economy and well-being of societies. The purple economy aims to shift patterns of gender inequalities by one, reducing double burden of women and freeing up their time for employment, entrepreneurship, and political participation, as well as self-care, leisure, and the rest, and by reducing educational disparities between girls and women and boys. The purple economy aims to overcome the fragility of the care economy at the national and international level and address the multiple and intersecting inequality created by disproportionate reliance on women, unpaid and unpaid labor, which is often, by the way, in developed nations provided by migrant women that are even more vulnerable, as well as underinvestment in the care sector. In such as that inequality faced by informal workers, migrant workers, as well as women of colors who make a large proportion of unpaid essential care workers can actually be paid fairly. The UN is also working on a satellite account to include unpaid and non-market activities performed within and between households to complement GDP the same way the system of environmental economics accounting, ecosystem accounting, to augment the GDP with measure of natural capital, such as forests and ocean and other ecosystems that we destroy in the process of creating physical capital, but also to include in these measures, these complementary measures, the value of women labor and unpaid labor in general. These calculations are powerful tools used to make visible women's contribution to the economies and the macroeconomic dimension of care work. As indicated earlier, the estimates are that if women unpaid work were monetized and considered into GDP, depending on countries, it would represent between 10 and 39% of the GDP. Now, the UNSG has also mandated 3 of our agencies to advance work on beyond GDP. This is to measure target 17.9. So basically, the GDP that we have right now would go up if you have a war because you've destroyed physical capital and you're going to take natural capital and then rebuild, and that would increase actually your GDP. But is it what people care about? What would a measure of progress and well-being look like that actually people care about. And this is something that we are actually developing right now at the UN under the leadership of the Secretary General. Now, let me go through the 5 policy recommendations or so that we have in this, the Purple Economy brief that we are handing to our country economists. We recommend the 5R approach: recognizing the issue, reducing and redistributing unpaid care, ensuring adequate reward system for paid care workers, and prioritizing representation of caregivers and care patients in policy design and evaluation. So in recognition, this is mostly done through social protection systems. So basically ensuring that there's actually affordable childcare so women can actually work, support for family caregivers, and paid leave and pension credit. The reduction, then this is investment in sustainable water, electricity, and transport infrastructure that decrease the unnecessary drudgery and time intensity of care work, especially in developing countries. Redistribution, the expansion, again, a lot of social protection here, expansion of affordable quality services for children, older person with disability that shift the responsibility from individual and household, often held by women, to more collective form of provision. And reward, where care is provided for pay, decent working condition, and equal pay for equal value are needed to protect a largely female workforce in public institution and private household. This must include paid domestic workers, many of whom are migrant women, as we saw earlier, who often lack basic labor rights and protections. And finally, representation. To be effective, priorities and policy options will be defined with the participation of these key stakeholders at the table, which right now often don't have their voice heard when these policies are being put in place. And I must say that I'm pretty proud that at UNCTAD, we were the first agency to actually mention that macroeconomics, or any policy for that matter, is not neutral. So whenever you put a policy in place, it will favor certain constituencies and at the expense of others. And in times of crisis, whether they're economic or natural or health related, like a pandemic like we have, women pay the price more. And after all the expenses that we've seen, what happened is we have a tendency to go back to austerity measure. Women and vulnerable group are also the one that get the most affected by these austerity measures, because women spend a greater percentage of their income on basic food, on the care, and on all of these other issues. And if we just saw it, if we cut in providing educational services, health services, transport services, women are affected directly because it increased their unpaid labor. So, and then what we're trying to do is to basically calculate the multiplier effect, that if you invest in the care economy, how many more jobs does that create? How much does that increase your economic growth? Because it does. And so this multiplier effect needs to be measured so that we can convince decision maker that this is not an expense. This doesn't go into the expenditure on health or education, on social protection. This is an investment in the care sector that actually favor and has many multiplier effect and benefit to the rest of the economy. And of course, we need to combat occupational segregation and promote women economic empowerment in the high growth sector. We're looking right now, just to give you a specific example, at NASA and all the work being done on Artemis. And there's a 50-50% women and men in research and all of these other issues. Where there's not 50-50 is in the private sector investment. There, women are underrepresented, and yet that's a high growth. Women are underrepresented in the renewable energy sector, owning that asset. And these are all high growth sector where women are not represented. And unless we address these issues, digital economy is another one. We will continue to have a wealth gap between women and men. And that lack of voice and that lack of seat at the table means that we will continue to have inequality, including in pay. And then right now, we basically have a mandate at the UN that we have to mainstream women, gender equality into each of our work. And this is something that our new Secretary General, former Prime Minister of Costa Rica, has vowed to do as well. So let me just quickly then, in concluding, mention a few things that we're doing at UNCTAD related to this. As I mentioned, economic policies and downturns are never gender neutral. And so we need to raise the alarm here as the interest rate are going up, and a lot of countries are starting to put these austerity measures in place that will actually further hurt women that were already hurt during the pandemic. So what do? We offer training on gender and trade that assess the impact of trade agreement on gender equality and that segregation of women into these low-paid, low-protection sectors. And we also try to work with women that do a lot of informal trade, especially in Africa, where they get abused verbally, physically, because they do not know their right. And yet they provide essential services to their communities. We also created the Improtec Women in Business Award as an acknowledgement of the great achievement of women entrepreneurs trained by our Improtec program in 43 countries around the world that improve their access to further training, widen their market access, and boost their motivation. And they also become role model in their communities, including our program on e-trade for all. So UNCTAD, as I mentioned earlier, work to empower developing countries to take advantage of commerce and trade and to develop. And one of the major areas is e-commerce and e-trade. And yet with this e-trade for all program, we realized real quick that women do face a lot more challenges than men. So we created the E-Trade for Women initiative in the digital space, where we have women representative in each of the developing region of the world that actually are interacting directly with decision makers. We put them in this situation so they can affect policies, but they also become role model for younger women in their region to actually go in this high growth field. We also provide capacity building to decision makers to be able to adjust their policies to address this fact that macroeconomic policies are not gender neutral, and we provide them tools to do that. So let me wrap up with some conclusion and recommendation. Inequality around the world, both within and among countries, have increased dramatically with the pandemic. We're facing a two-speed recovery of developing countries versus developed countries. Gap that were already too wide just got wider in gender equality, access to social security and health, education, nutrition, the divide between the formal and informal workers, between the big and the small businesses, the offline and the online, and we need to act very quickly. And so what I would like to offer is what we need to keep in mind is we need to help our decision maker formulating and implementing pay equality specific policy at the national and international level, recognizing the vital role of women in the economy and the need for supporting the principle of equal pay for equal work and women's full and equal participation, including in leadership and management position in all areas of sustainable development, including the recognition of unpaid care, and promoting investment sector where women are predominantly employed, and to achieve, and then supporting women entrepreneurs, and the women empowerment principle of corporate social responsibility for the Global Compact. All of these are example of how we need to move forward, but we really need to increase the ambition level to face the dire situation that women are right now.